Okay, so I wanted to pick up with where we left off with the Great Awakening. And so once you have the Enlightenment and then you have, excuse me, the Great Awakening, the next thing that happens that's big is the French and Indian War. So to understand what's going on with the French in the New World, you have to think about the wars that are going on in Europe. There basically have been 9 world wars total, and the French and Indian War was actually one of those wars. It was actually not just the French and Indian War, it was called the 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War in America. The reason is that when the war was over in America, the war was not over in the rest of the world, so it continued for basically 3 more years. So it was actually a 9 year war, but it was the French and Indian War as well, so the dates are a little strange. The American people have unfortunately been unable to stay out of any of the world wars. Since our founding, we seem to love war, military, all of that, and so that's my statement about that. But you can't, it's undeniable we're in all of them. So anyway, all right, so France was late coming to the New World like England. Spain was out there. They were the ones out there doing this. The Portuguese were out exploring, and England and France had been too busy fighting each other to worry about what was going on in the New World. So France goes on and they become great, and people are pretty much happy at home. They're not dying to get out of there like they are in Europe, in England particularly. They are, and England has been fighting with France to be the biggest and the best in Europe for years. France is still a big deal there. Spain begins its decline almost after the beginning of the exploration, when they start bringing in all of the silver and the gold from the New World. That's basically the beginning of their decline. So there's more to be said about that, but later. So you had King Louis XIV and his friends. He was in charge for 72 years from the time he was 5 years old, and he was most interested in overseas colonization, much like Ferdinand and Isabella with Spain. So Quebec was the first French settlement in 1608. Samuel de Champlain, and this is a picture of him, he was considered the father of New France. He made multiple trips to the New World, and he establishes great relations with the Huron Indians, who will then back him in the French and Indian War. And so the Iroquois become their enemies, and the Iroquois take up arms with the British against the French. So you have the Hurons and the French on one side, and the British with the Iroquois on the other. So New France is controlled by the king after all these commercial companies fail. They're there for trading only. They're not really there for colonization like the English are. The English were being persecuted for the most part. They were there for money and religion, or religious freedom for themselves, of course. And then the French were there basically to trade. At any given, at the height of France's occupation of Canada, there weren't more than 40-50,000 French people living there in the total of Canada. They just weren't happy enough at home for the moment, and so they were not dying to leave. You had traders, and you had missionaries, Jesuit missionaries, who were trying to convert the Native Americans. The government in New France was autocratic. There were no representative assemblies like in the English colonies. There were no rights to a jury trial like in the English colonies. And so the Protestant Huguenots were denied refuge there. And France was more interested in their sugar colonies for the rum in the Caribbean. They were most interested in the beaver trade. The Europeans' fashion was the beaver skin, and so these traders were living free. They were, free lovers. They drank with gusto, and they spent their money. This is just an image of beaver skin hat, the beaver fur hat, and then this is an image with all the beaver furs hanging up after they've been skinned. So you had, as I said, with the Jesuits, they were not, they were not very successful in converting the Native Americans, and we'll talk about that later. But they were best with geography and as explorers and traders, of course. You had Antoine Cadillac, as in Cadillac, Michigan, who founded Detroit, and that's where we get all the names of our cars. You had a LaSalle car, you had Pontiac, you had Cadillac. So it's very interesting how we get the names for our cars out of the names of history, but anyway, that's another story. They founded Detroit to stop the English from moving in, and they founded it in 1701. They had posts all up and down the Mississippi River through to Louisiana, from Louisiana to what is now Michigan, to stop Spain. And so the most important of these ports was at the south end of the Mississippi River in New Orleans, that was founded in 1718. Even then, they were floating grain down the Mississippi River to be shipped out to the Indies and into Europe. They wanted to ship it to the Indies to feed the enslaved population. You had wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War. The French were fighting the British, of course. They're all recruiting for Indian allies. They didn't have any real support from home because the wars that were occurring in Europe spilled over into all the colonies. So if you were fighting at home, then the colonies were also fighting. And it did become a world war regardless. They didn't have any support militarily from home, so they ended up with guerrilla warfare that they had learned from the Indians, which will sink the British troops eventually, because the American colonists in the Revolution, then they learned the guerrilla warfare from the French and Indian War. So there's a preparation here with the French and Indian War. Without the French and Indian War, your revolution would not have occurred in 1776. It might have occurred 100 years later or 50 years later, but it would not have occurred at the time without the French and Indian War. So it's an important war that gets skipped over a lot. Okay, so French Indian allies torched the British settlements on the frontier. The most notable is Deerfield, Massachusetts. They burned it to the ground, and there were many, many, many casualties. The Spain backs France because they're so ticked off at England, and they go and they start poking and prodding at English through in South Carolina. Okay, so the War of Jenkins' Ear was the British versus the Spanish. The reason I mention this is it's a local connection with St. Simon's. The battles took place there. And so you had all this fighting going on. You don't have to know all the details of all of this fighting, but there are details that are there. There's a lot of fighting going on between the big three: France, England, and Spain. Okay, so George Washington and the French and Indian War. What does George Washington have to say about anything? Well, he's 21 years old. He is a rich guy, a well-to-do man in Virginia. He has money. He married Martha Custis, who was a widow, who was arguably the richest woman in Virginia. Her deceased husband had left her with all of the plantation that he had. All of his wealth was left to her. She had 2 children, Patsy and Jackie. And so Washington marries her, and you could say it was a marriage of 2 huge families and rich families and all that, but they say that they really did love each other, and so it was not just a marriage of convenience or a marriage for money. And he takes her 2 kids and basically raises them as his own. When he marries her, by law in Virginia, when you marry, all of whatever the woman's assets are, they become that of the husband. So Washington acquires all of Daniel Custis's, basically, all of his assets, making him the richest man in Virginia. As a result of this wealth, he looks to increase his wealth, to buy land. Well, he gets in a deal with the Virginia Company, not the Virginia Company of early colonial days. This is another Virginia company. And the governor at the time, Robert Dinwiddie, sends Washington to get the French out of the Ohio Valley. The Virginia Company is looking to, is a land speculation company. So what they're going to do is they want to go out here and get all this quote unquote free land out here in the Ohio Valley. So they're going to send, it's a private deal. And so it would be frowned upon now, of course, because it's a private deal and they're sending militiamen out there to fix this so that the British can continue to expand their land holdings here. Now, this is the French have all of this here, west of the Appalachians. So the governor goes and tells George Washington, who has no military experience whatsoever, however, he's rich. He says he gives him 200 men, and he says, take these guys out here and tell these French they have to leave. They have to leave the Ohio Valley. It's ours. Well, the French get out there. They're already out there, and they keep coming from Fort Detroit. They keep moving southward, and this really irks the English. So 1754, George Washington is 21 years old, and he is sent with 200 men or so out to the Ohio Valley. He finds some British guys, soldiers who are out there in the wilderness, and he says, you guys got to go. And the French guys just look at him and laugh, and they're like, no, we don't. Well, Washington ends up firing on these guys, and they have a battle that occurs. Meanwhile, Washington builds Fort Necessity. Fort Necessity is out here, and he builds this fort, so to speak, in a bowl. So if you're a military guy and you want to be in an advantageous position, you do not want to be in the lowlands. You want to be high up so that you can see what's going on around you and not be fired on by people on the higher ground. So you don't want to be in a bowl. Well, he goes in his inexperience and builds this ramshackle little fort in a bowl, and the French have him for lunch. They allow him and his men to leave, but he comes back to Virginia with his tail tucked between his legs, so to speak, and the war is on. So there are skirmishes for 2 years between 1754 and 1756, and that's when war is officially declared. They fought this war in Europe, the West Indies, actually Gibraltar, the Philippines, Africa, and on the oceans. So this war was all over the place. So this is all about Fort Necessity, and so you have British and Prussia against France, Spain, Russia, and Austria. So it's a world war. America was not so involved in it except from their perspective. This was a much bigger war that is an important part, because Britain and France were also involved in these battles in other places. So it was not just, they couldn't focus on the colonies so much. So they were spread thin on both sides. So in 1754, the British government, they say, we're going to have a colonial congress. Now this is a big deal because this is the first one that's going to occur. Up until this point, the colonies have all been focusing on themselves. They've been functioning as 13 different places, like 13 separate countries, because they were all founded on different principles. One would be for religious principles. The other one was for money, like Virginia. Massachusetts was for religion. Georgia was a philanthropic type deal with Oglethorpe. South Carolina was founded by Barbadian plantation owners who were looking to have more land for their younger sons because the land was running out in Barbados for plantations. So anyway, there were all kinds of reasons. So these colonies were not working together. They were working as separate entities, and there was really no reason for them to collaborate on anything. This is the first time that happens. Finally, they see, we got to think about this a minute. We're British colonies together. So only 7 of the 13 colonies were represented in Albany at the Albany Congress. However, that is a big deal because this is the first stab at working together. So this Albany Congress, they're going to bribe the Iroquois everywhere they go. Anything they have to do with the British and the Iroquois or any Native Americans deals with bribes. They call them gifts, but they're bribes. So you have 30 wagon loads. These Iroquois leave this meeting with a lot of bribes. 30 wagon loads full of gifts, guns, all kinds. We're arming the Indians who will then use the guns against us, which is just insane, but they do it. Because that's what the Native Americans want. They want cloth. They want pans and pots and all kinds of metal things that they can't make themselves. And so they get them from the British and the French. Word has it, though, that the Native Americans like the British gifts, quote unquote gifts, they're bribes. They like the British gifts better because the gifts last longer. The French made cheap gifts. And so the idea is that the British, their goods were better. So they make sure with their 30 wagon loads that these Iroquois are going to be loyal in this war. Longer term, this Albany Congress is colonial unity. They want to bolster this common defense. We're all got to work together against the French. And this is where people think that this image, this join or die, is from the Revolution. Not so. This cartoon is published by Benjamin Franklin in the Pennsylvania Gazette, the first newspaper in the colonies, a month before the Congress meets. So this is not an American Revolution image. This is a French and Indian War image created by Benjamin Franklin. So we have General Edward Braddock. He is sent here from England to fight for the British. He's going to lead the forces because obviously George Washington is not going to. George is going to be a big player in this, and George's military career is made in this campaign. So they send these guys to Virginia. They don't send them well supplied. They expect the colonies are going to do that. So he leaves Virginia with 2,000 men. They're going to capture Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne no longer exists. It is where the Pittsburgh Pirates ball field sits at the convergence of the two rivers in Pittsburgh. So there's a stadium on top of it now, or baseball field. So anyway, it doesn't exist as far as the exact location because there's a stadium on top. But anyway, these were untrained, badly disciplined militiamen. These militiamen were the only kind of army there was. The Brits were not going to allow them to have their own army, and they were not going to station military personnel here because it was expensive, and they were using them in France, in England and Europe. So you have all these militiamen, and then you have a few of the British redcoats, the ones who are so well trained. They're arguably the best trained forces in the world. They spend more money, they have better equipment, and they spend more time with these guys training them. So the troops are very disturbed that they have to hang out with the militiamen because those militiamen don't do very well. They are a ragtag group. They're in their own clothes. They have to bring their own guns and ammunition from home. They are left at home, and they are trained. The only thing they know to do is like the guerrilla warfare that they've learned from the Native Americans. So they're looked down upon. The militiamen are looked down upon by the British regulars. They have the militiamen are trained once a month. They get together sort of like the reserves, except instead of the reservist type thing, what they do is they get around and they chew the fat, and they're glad to be away from their wives, sitting around the fire, chewing tobacco or whatever, and drinking beer and not doing much. So they go away for these weekends, and they're not really doing anything. The problem is that these militiamen elect their leaders. They don't have trained leaders. They're elected, so it's a popularity contest, which makes it worse. So it's a bad scene regardless, all the way around. So anyway, during this war, this battle on the way to Fort Duquesne, you have a small French and Indian contingent, French army and Indian contingent. At first, the British start to win, but the British have a 4-mile long wagon train. They have their supply train. It's about 4 miles long, and they're out there in the wilderness, and so once they begin, the Indians and the French fire on them from the woods, and there's nothing those guys can do, the redcoats can do about it. And it's a mix. The problem is the mix between the British way of full-on frontal assault in a field and this guerrilla warfare. It's two different ways of fighting. I'm going to post a video clip that shows this very well from The Last of the Mohicans. I always show this because it's an excellent example of how these British were fighting and what their weaknesses were because they were so unwilling to give up their old way of fighting. So this man, Edward Braddock, is mortally wounded in this war. I'm sorry, in this battle. There are horrible losses for the British. George Washington takes the helm, and this makes his career because he's the one who has to get the troops back to Virginia, back to safety, and he does that very well. So I'm going to stop that here, and then I'm going to pick it up again so that this video doesn't turn out to be too long.